Hi, I'm Dr. Walter Matwichuk, and the purpose of today's intermittent reinforcement email message is to encourage you to do self-therapy. Rationally motive behavior therapy teaches you ideas that help you face adversity and have a healthy response to adversity. However, you have to know when to call upon these ideas, when to invoke them. And so one of the things that I teach people is to simply evaluate the responses in terms of whether their emotional and behavioral responses are healthy and adaptive or unhealthy and maladaptive. Now, generally speaking, if you use this simple question, you will identify instances when it would be good for you to stop and do an ABC analysis. Once you've noted that you are responding to a negative state of affairs, or what we call an adversity in REBT, and you're responding with an unhealthy emotional or behavioral reaction, that is one that undermines your goals, all your goals, not just your immediate goals, but your long-term goals. Once you are acknowledging that you are responding in an unhealthy way, that's just the time when you need to stop and do an ABC analysis. And when you do an ABC analysis, you need to recognize that you can just take out a piece of paper and put down the letters A, B, C, D, and E, and then begin to fill out the different components of the ABC analysis. Start with the A. Describe what it is that you're responding to. And most importantly, describe what about that situation you find most provocative emotionally. What is the distressing element to the situation that you're facing? That's your critical inference. So it might be that someone's betraying you. It might be that life is working against you. It might be that you're predicting you may fail. It might be that you are thinking that you're carrying an unfair burden. These are the types of things that you're going to put at A. Now let's see, you want to identify your unhealthy emotion and or the unhealthy behavior that goes with that emotion. So you could identify, anger, depression, shame, guilt, unhealthy envy, unhealthy jealousy, and depression, and then you can go and direct your attention to B. That's your basic attitude. Now, there are three basic attitudes. We can either put that attitude on ourselves, like I have to do outstandingly well and be lovable. We could put the rigid attitude on you, on other people. You must treat me kindly. You must treat me fairly. And thirdly, we can put the rigid attitude on life itself. My living conditions must be comfortable and gratifying. Life must be easy. It's usually one of these three attitudes that's responsible for our emotional upset. You might also want to examine whether or not you're responding with a derivative attitude, because the theory says that from these rigid attitudes, sometimes an extreme attitude will come about. Now, there are three basic extreme attitudes. One is an extreme rating of how bad something is. This is when we say, it's awful, it's terrible, it's the end of the world. So, for example, I might say, I absolutely have to do outstandingly well, and if I don't do outstandingly well, then it's awful, it's terrible, it's the end of the world. So I would break them down into two separate ideas. I have to do outstandingly well, and then the second idea would be, it's awful, it's terrible if I don't. So that way you can dispute each one of them. The second attitude you may want to look for is attitudes of unbearability. And they might go along the lines of, my living conditions must be easy and comfortable, and if not, it's awful. It's unbearable. It's intolerable. Things have to go my way, and if they don't go my way, I can't stand it. Now, the third attitude that people will experience, the derivative attitude, is what we call devaluation. And you can devaluate yourself, you could devalue someone else, or you could devalue life itself. So, for example, you might say, you have to treat me lovingly and kindly, right? That's the demand. And then you might say, and if you don't treat me that way, that makes you a bad person. I might also hold the attitude, I have to do perfectly well, and if I don't do perfectly well, that means I'm a failure. We could put the demand on life itself. So life must be comfortable and easy, and if it's not, it's totally bad. And so, again, I would break these into two separate ideas and dispute each one. Now, once you have your A, B, and C, you can begin the process of reflection, evaluating these ideas. And there are basically 4 different disputes. One is a functional dispute, where you ask the question, is my attitude helping me accomplish my goals? What are my goals? To be happy, to change what I can change, and to live happily with those things I can't. And generally speaking, the answer is your rigid and extreme attitudes don't help you functionally. That's why you're doing an ABC analysis. But don't just stop with, it's not these ideas are not helping me. Specify why they're not helping you. So, for example, you might say, well, when I demand that other people treat me nicely and lovingly, then I get angry and I say things I wish I hadn't said. Functionally, when I demand that I do outstandingly well, what happens? I procrastinate and I don't learn by doing. So these are the functional disputes. Now, the second dispute you can use is what's called an empirical dispute. An empirical dispute is something different. It's when you ask yourself, is there empirical evidence that you could point to that would support your rigid or extreme attitude? So, for example, if you held the attitude that life has to be easy for a doll like me, right? Or it's totally bad, you could then say, well, where's the evidence that life has to be easy? And of course, you could look at all the people in the world that don't have an easy life, and that would be clear empirical evidence that your attitude is false to the facts. And again, you want to not just say, well, there's no evidence for my rigid attitude, or this attitude's extreme and it's false. And you want to specify why it's false, or why there's no evidence, because this gets you to think deeply about your attitude. So you might say, well, the idea that I have to have an easy life is false. Well, the evidence that is false is found in the fact that other people don't have an easy life. So what makes me so special that my life must be easy? Or you might say, where's the evidence I can't bear this particular burden? And you could then say, well, do other people bear burdens that are equally bad or even worse than the burden I'm bearing? And the answer would be, well, they're bearing it insofar as they're, alive and kicking. So therefore, they're bearing their burden and I'm bearing my burden. So it's false for me to hold the attitude I can't bear this particular burden. It's false to the facts. And again, don't just say there's no empirical evidence. Actually specify why it's false to the facts. Now you could then go on to a logical dispute. And the logical dispute would identify the preference you hold and how your rigid attitude doesn't logically follow from this flexible attitude. So, for example, Ellis argued that we think in non sequiturs, and we'll say things like, I really like it when people treat me kindly, and therefore they must. Now, the idea that people must treat me kindly may very well be something that I'm aware of, that I hold that attitude. But what I'm not aware of is the preceding preference, like, well, because I treat people kindly, therefore they must treat me kindly. And what we would want to do is expose the premise or the preference and look at the conclusion and convince ourselves that the conclusion that other people must treat me kindly does not logically follow the premise that because I treat people kindly, therefore they have to. And what you want to do is change that into a logical statement, like, even though I may treat people nicely, it doesn't follow that they have to treat me nicely. Or even though I wish the world were a nice and easy place to live in, it doesn't follow that it has to be. Now, the final dispute is what's called teach a child dispute. And the idea here is that you examine your rigid attitude and ask yourself, would I teach a child to think this way? So, for example, if you're saying to yourself, people have to treat me kindly, would you teach a child that? Or would you teach your child that they want people to treat them kindly, but it doesn't follow that they have to? And generally speaking, people, when they change this point of view and look at their rigid and extreme attitudes and say, would I teach these attitudes to a child I loved? The answer is clearly no. But again, you need to specify why you wouldn't teach a child. Well, I wouldn't teach a child to think this way because then they're going to get angry and hurt with nearly everybody they encounter, because nearly everybody we encounter at one time or another are going to not treat us the way we'd like them to treat us. Or if they're holding the attitude, I have to do outstandingly well, the question then becomes, would you teach a child to think that way? And of course, the answer is no, but why would you not teach a child to think that way? Well, because they would procrastinate a great deal. And when people hold the attitude that they have to do it outstandingly well, they don't allow themselves to do something imperfectly, and they don't learn by doing. And so the procrastination keeps them from cultivating skill in different areas of their lives. So now, you don't have to do all 4 disputes, but the theory says that the more you challenge your ideas from different directions, the more likely you're going to expose to yourself the problematic features of your rigid and extreme attitudes. And all this internal dialogue is aimed at creating a new attitude, a new effective attitude, which might go along the lines of you could ask yourself this question. If my attitude is not functional, if my rigid attitude is not functional, if it's there's no evidence to support it, if it's illogical, and if I wouldn't teach it to a child, well, what would be a new attitude that I'd be happy to teach to a child that would help them function in the world, that would have empirical evidence to support it and be logical? And of course, that is your effective new attitude. And this is the attitude that would lead you to change what you can change, accept what you can't, and to live happily, even though there may be aspects of life that you can't change and wish you could. Now, this psychotherapy process, this self-therapy, is the aim that we have in RUT. We try to teach people to be their own REBT therapists. And unless you try to do this process, you're just not going to become your own therapist. Now, there's nothing wrong with going to therapy every week, of course, but it's best if you learn how to help yourself, because you're with yourself 24/7, and this process can be learned by most people, if not all, if they just work at it. But you have to allow yourself to do it imperfectly. You can't hold the attitude that it's too hard to do. You can't hold the attitude even that you have to do all 4 disputes. You could allow yourself to try it. You could allow yourself to struggle with it. You could allow yourself to do just one of the disputes. And chances are, if you make some effort at self-therapy, you'll derive some benefit from the process. And each time you do it, you'll get closer to having healthier responses, or you'll get yourself back on the healthy track. Last thing I'd like to mention is that every Saturday you could witness me going through this process with a volunteer. I call it the Saturday Rational Emotive Behavioral Conversation Hour. And I take a volunteer from somewhere in the world and we discuss a real problem, and I show them how to go through this process. And the more you watch, the process being done on someone else, the better you're going to get at doing it with yourself. So I'd strongly encourage you to attend. It's free to attend. It's on Zoom. It's at Saturday. It's 9 a.m. in Philadelphia every Saturday. So that would be 2 p.m. in the UK, 4 p.m. in Bucharest, 6:30 in New Delhi, 10 o'clock in Japan, and 10:30 in South Australia. We have a worldwide audience. We've been doing it now for almost 145 weeks or so. And people get a chance to ask questions on the dialogue that they observe after the dialogue has been completed. So I usually work with people for 40 minutes and then I take questions. The volunteer gets a link to the conversation so that they can go over the conversation. So I'd strongly encourage you to attend, but you need to get the link. So you can write to me for it at rebtdoctor@gmail.com. That's rebtdoctor@gmail.com. And you can specify that you want to attend the Zoom conversation hour. So I hope to see you on Saturday, but more importantly, I hope you remember to ask yourself, am I having a healthy response to the adversity I'm currently facing? And if not, then let me do an ABC analysis. Even if I do it imperfectly, I'll still likely derive some benefit from it.